Today we are discussing Nosferatu. And I was going to do the entire podcast in that voice, but I'm rethinking that now. So I'm Gil, and I'm here with my brother Daniel. Say hello.
Hey.
In your Nosferatu voice.
Hello. You cut me off so that I just said hell, which I think is a good starter.
Hell. Welcome to hell. And that's what the next couple of hours are going to be. Because let's go into our overall thoughts. And I'll say I'll just go right into it because I feel like I've already opened up the doors, the gates. The last couple of days have been very obsessive for me because we went into this movie. I think both of us, would you say you had high expectations?
No, I think I had reasonable expectations. Like, I thought it would be good.
Okay.
I don't think I went in expecting to be blown away.
Yeah, probably in part because we've talked about this before. You are terrified of horror movies.
Yes.
Just the mention of the word horror has you quaking in your boots.
If I were wearing boots, I'd be quaking in them right now.
Right. Now, you've clarified this many times. Specifically, usually you're talking about just gore with reckless abandon is not what you're looking for. But you don't have any issue with the horror genre as a whole. I always just like to say that.
No, yeah, and jump scares. I don't do that well with jump scares. Although, I think one of my New Year's resolutions is I actually want to embrace horror a little bit more. Like, I watched 28 Days Later a few weeks ago, and that's a great movie, but I actually was scared to watch it because I don't like horror. And it was great. Like, I loved it. And I know it's not that horror of a movie, but I think I should embrace the genre a little more. And I think I should also embrace the, adrenaline rush you get out of horror. Like, I feel like that's worth, I don't know, trying out a little bit more.
I just want to feel something. And you didn't know horror was here all this time to fill that void for you. It's a great genre. There's a lot of great things in horror. It's one of my favorite genres. And so I think I probably went into Nosferatu with pretty high expectations. Super talented filmmaker, Robert Eggers, classic story. I was hoping he was going to put his own spin on it. He definitely did in certain ways, but you and I, as the movie was going, I think you looked at me, you're like, wait, this is Dracula. I don't know if you knew the whole, we just recently covered 1992's Dracula. I guess, did you know the backstory of how Nosferatu was essentially intended to be a Dracula movie, back in 1922?
So embarrassingly, I'm pretty sure you've explained that to me before. In fact, I think we might have it recorded. I think you might have talked about that on our last Dracula recording, but I completely forgot. I knew it was a Dracula story, but I thought it was a different story about Dracula. I didn't think it was going to be the exact same movie I watched a month and a half ago.
Yeah, just with different names. Improved names, like Van Helsing, lame. But instead of that, we have, I want to get the full name here, Albin Eberhard von Franz. Way better than Van Helsing.
It's kind of do you remember when we first started watching House of the Dragon? And to us, it started to feel like off-brand Game of Thrones. Because it's the same, but different. I did... there were points in this movie, obviously it was extremely well produced, but it did feel like I was watching off-brand Bram Stoker's Dracula. That's not really accurate because it didn't seem worse. I don't know.
Well, in theory, it is off-brand Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah.
Because that was I think most people probably know the backstory, but in brief, for people who don't, back in the 1920s, they wanted to make a Dracula movie, didn't have the rights, so they said, you know what, let's call it Nosferatu and change all the characters' names. Turned out that wasn't good enough. They got sued by Bram Stoker's widow. A judge ordered, I think, every copy of the movie destroyed. Thankfully, a few survived, and one of the greatest original horror films from the silent era, Nosferatu, survives to this day. And Robert Eggers just put his own spin on it. Now, all the stuff you're talking about, it was kind of a double-edged sword for me. At times, it was something against this movie because I know the whole story. So it's like the movie, I wanted it to work a little harder to keep my attention because part of what keeps your attention watching a movie is I wonder what's going to happen next. At the same time, it almost worked in the movie's favor because it did change the characters enough. And it felt like new characters that are about to go through a journey I know. And it almost created a sense of dread because Nicholas Hoult is not, I wouldn't have used the word naive necessarily to describe him, but he seemed not cynical or pessimistic enough about what lied ahead for him. He did remind me in some ways of the Keanu Reeves character, but he was fresh enough where I worried for him heading into Nosferatu or Count Orlok, i.e. Dracula's castle. So it kind of worked both ways for me, the fact that it's essentially a remake. I mean, it is a remake, but it's a remake of Nosferatu, and in a way, it's a remake of Dracula. But it borrowed from a few different versions, which was interesting. But I guess we've kind of danced around it a bunch, where you can hear some degree of disappointment in my voice, and it's that I liked the movie. I thought it was good, but it seems like I'm missing out on some of the fun because the feeling I get is that everybody thought it was amazing, a great movie, and it has set me into a tailspin where I've started to question, do I even know what's a good movie? Have I watched too many and I've just burned myself out on it? And then I was like, wait a minute. Everything else Robert Eggers has done, I've loved all the movies. I have some issues with them, but usually it's more on a thematic level than on the actual execution. And like if I go back to The Witch, now it's been years since I saw that. I don't think you've seen it, but it's one of the first movies I've seen. No, that's not true. It's a recent example of a movie I've seen where I would describe it as bleak. But I've seen a few movies since then in the horror genre that I would similarly describe as bleak. And I put that in a separate category from dark. You can have movies that deal with dark themes, but when I say it's bleak, what I mean is that early on, I know where it's going. Everyone's going to die. Everyone's going to suffer. And it rubs me the wrong way sometimes, not necessarily because, oh, this stuff is too tough for me. I don't want to deal with these difficult themes. It's more, it just becomes predictable. And then there's a question of, if I know what's going to happen, why am I torturing myself just by watching all these people go through absolute misery and torture? But that's kind of all that to say, I thought The Witch was a great movie and it kept me engaged and engrossed the whole time. But now I think back on it as one of those examples of a bleak movie. And since then, I'll start certain horror movies and I can tell, oh, this is one of those. And now I know what's going to happen. One small example of it in Nosferatu, and I'll say right now, spoilers for the movie, as always. But early on, they introduced these two very young girls, like 5 years old. And I was like, well, they're being introduced because they're going to die later. And like, is that a problem? Like, is it a problem that I know precisely what's going to happen because it's Robert Eggers? I know he's not going to introduce two of the most innocent, only purely innocent characters in the movie because they're too young to have really done anything wrong by their own accord. They're there so they can die later. And is that a problem? I don't know. Maybe. For me, it was because, again, not because I can't deal with that, but because it makes it predictable. But I feel like I'm taking all these circuitous routes. But here, I'll just summarize what I loved about the movie. Incredible visuals. Great attention to detail. That's one thing Robert Eggers always does great. He puts us into a historical time period, but it feels like he does it without the romanticism of looking at it through today's lens. It truly feels like he took a camera and sent it back in time to the 1800s. I love how, on a similar point, it strips away a lot of the romanticism that we've attached to vampires. Although, from some of the reviews I've read, some would disagree with me. I don't think anyone's looking at Count Orlok like, oh my God. Versus 1992's Dracula, when he becomes young again, there are people who were like, I was torn at the end. I was kind of rooting for Mina to get with Dracula. And I'm like, he ate a baby earlier in the movie. How could you root for him to have love with Mina? But I think most people would agree in this movie, there is no romanticism around Count Orlok. They've made him, or Eggers has made him, as disgusting as a vampire would actually be in real life. Because I'm sorry, no matter how you slice it, if someone bites you, I don't care if it's done sensually, and then drains your body of blood, it's not cool. And in this movie, I think he made a great choice of the bite happens on your chest. And I kept feeling it, because I feel like the neck thing, you're so used to seeing it. so it's kind of worn off. But watching him bite into your chest and imagining like going through the bones and maybe he's puncturing your heart at a certain point, that felt very visceral. And as he's sucking the blood out, he looks like a corpse. And the way that that corpse basically convulses with every gulp, it's disgusting.
And you hear it, right? Like you hear the blood gushing into his like stomach.
Yeah, and it's actually stomach churning, which I think it should be. That's all the stuff I thought was great about the movie. But for me, and one thing I've done over the last few days is I've actually read a bunch of reviews of this movie, and I've been trying to pinpoint where am I differing, and I've been drilling down into the details to try and find precisely where is my opinion and my experience with the movie different from other people's. And I think I've kind of found it. But one thing I'll just say is that for me, narrative tends to be paramount. A movie can be visually engrossing. It can have great ideas, but I always look at it like the thing which holds your attention is the story. And I felt like the story in this movie, there's a very large portion, essentially the middle section, where it really drags. And there's one pet peeve I have is when a character is sort of hypnotized or sleepwalking or drugged up under a spell, not in control of their actions. At that point, they essentially cease to be a character. They're a puppet for somebody else. And if all you have are puppets on strings, to me, there's no tension because tension comes from hope. It comes from a character trying to achieve something or trying to avoid some fate. And maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But if you get rid of the trying part, because the character's under a spell, they're not trying to do anything, a lot of that tension just goes away. Essentially, the characters have no agency. And there was a while here, and we'll get into the details, where I felt like I was just watching a bunch of people sleepwalk toward oblivion. I have more to say, but I feel like I've rambled for a bit. I'm dragging on now. Daniel, what did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree. I would say two main things. One, yeah, the narrative. I got bored for the exact reasons you described, and the fact that I've seen this story before. Right, there were a few changes, but I've seen the story. I knew at every point what was going to happen. It just couldn't keep my attention. And then I think part of also why it didn't keep my attention was the themes, which we'll get into, didn't really connect for me. I didn't really care about the themes, or they just didn't make sense. Like I didn't really understand what I was being told. So I didn't get what I was being told, and I didn't feel like I was being told it in a very interesting way. There were some visuals that were cool. I don't know, and that's kind of it for me. And maybe as we go through it, I'm going to appreciate more of it. I don't know, but I was just bored. I tried to rewatch it last night. My intention was let me rewatch it, come in fresh. I couldn't watch it again. I was too bored.
Yeah, I did watch the movie twice. And yeah, if the problem is the first time I watched it, I was like, well, I know this story from Dracula. Well, now the second time I watch it, I'm like, I know this story from Dracula. And from the time I watched the same movie 3 days ago, it didn't help. I think it's funny because I remember, we might have talked about this in our Dracula 1992 review, but I think the Dracula story, and I haven't read the book, but at least the main beats of it that are typically presented on film, I think the story has a fundamental issue, which is when the Thomas character is in the castle and half dead because he's been getting drained of blood and he's partly under a spell. And then back in Nosferatu's take in Germany, you have the Ellen character or Mina in Dracula, and she's under a spell. There's this whole section there where, again, there's just characters who are puppets on a string, and the only one who's actually moving the story forward is Dracula or Orlok. I think that's a problem with the story, at least for me. And I thought that Coppola's take sort of corrected for that by adding the tragic backstory where Dracula lost his wife hundreds of years ago. And so he has actually, once again, he's the only one driving the story forward, but at least that story has more meat to it. He's not just coming to eat somebody or to this random girl. It's she's the resurrection of the woman he loved hundreds of years ago. It makes his story a little more interesting. So while all the other characters are predisposed, under his curse, he has more to do, and it made the movie more interesting. Now, this movie did add the interesting wrinkle, which I think gives it a little more to chew on thematically. But the fact that it starts with Ellen calling for a spirit, for any degree of comfort, and that's what triggers Nosferatu, Count Orlok, to come to her originally, and why he's coming back later.
But that's,
I see you're not happy about that.
but that's the other issue with this movie is what is that character? What is she? Because she's basically hypnotized like the entire movie, I guess. Right? I mean, to me, it almost seems like the only thing she does really of her own accord is call on, the devil or whatever. Like, she does that at the beginning. And then I guess at the end, she gives her life, and so, okay, so like that's sort of the thing she does with agency at the end. But I don't know, like throughout the movie, she's just like hypnotized. I don't know, like it's hard for me.
Well, yeah, and I think if you drill down, and just one clarifying point, which we'll also talk about in the recap, but she didn't intentionally call on the devil. I mean, I think this starts to get into one of the themes of the movie, but she has always been spiritually in tune with something else. Later, she talks about how when she first meets von Franz, she's telling him about her childhood. She always knew what Christmas gifts she was going to get before she got them. Which, let me tell you this, if you're making a list of the gifts you want, and then you get those gifts, that doesn't count. But she also knew when her mother was going to die, so she could clearly get a feel for the future and what's coming. But in this society, nobody took her seriously. And for some reason, when she's like, I could tell the future, nobody took her seriously. But when she was having any kinds of issues, what they called melancholy, she wasn't taken seriously. And she was driven into isolation to such a point of desperation that she called out into the night, I need something, anything, some spirit, come to me. And Count Orlok answered the call. In a way, it felt like, not an answer to, but a different perspective on a Joker-like situation, where Joker, in the movie Joker, was driven to do something horrible. It was his own choice, but you could look at it and say he had issues. He didn't have the support system or the help he needed, and it put him in a desperate position that caused something terrible to happen. Now, I think he's evil. Ellen, not evil. She did not call on the devil. She just called for any kind of help. But when you're calling into the spiritual realm, we've all learned when you knock on that door, you don't know who's going to answer. Could be your grandfather who passed away that you want to see again, or it could be some wily spirit taking his form. That's why you shouldn't play with Ouija boards, because you just don't know. It just opens. It's like taking an antenna and just who knows what channels you're going to pick up.
Okay. That actually, I didn't really understand that. That makes a lot more sense. Okay. That helps. Yeah. That helps as we go through this.
If I had to summarize the entire movie's theme with one visual, it would be when Ellen is kind of half asleep because they've doped her up on ether, and she starts sort of crying out, he's coming, or something along those lines. And then Dr. Sievers, just takes a rag to give her more ether and just essentially shuts her up, just like sticks his hand over his mouth, and the camera zooms in right on that. And it's him just silencing her, because the assumption is everything she's going through is irrational, and it's just be quiet. And I feel like that image is a great summation of the theme and just how she's abused throughout the movie and in the events leading up to the movie. Yes, I think if you were to drill down on where did I differ from others in the review world, I think, well, number one, a lot of people love the movie primarily for the visuals, and that's enough. And they'll even say some of the story doesn't work for me. Some of the dialogue feels a little silly and doesn't work for me. But on visuals alone, they love it. And that's just somewhere where I subjectively differ, because for me, story just tends to be more important. Maybe that's a shortcoming of mine, that I need to be able to appreciate movies more, whether the story is engaging to me or not.
I don't...
Maybe.
I mean, a movie is not just visuals. Like, it's obviously not. Like, essential to a movie is narrative. I don't know. Like, maybe that's subjective. I'm just not sure. Like, I feel like a film is supposed to have a narrative. Like, if you just want cool visuals, like, that's a different art form.
Yeah, at the same time, like I would never put a rule out there instead and say these movies should cease to exist. Because if somebody wants to do something that's really focused on striking visuals and they feel that's the best way for them to communicate something they're feeling and it works for somebody else, and I guess it's maybe I just don't, it's like my brain doesn't know what to do with that. Because once I see the visual for a few seconds, I'm like, okay, I've seen it. And then if there's no story and then it's just that visual, I immediately get bored. But maybe my mind is supposed to sort of meditate on that visual. I'm supposed to be thinking more. I don't know. But just at least I can say those reviews, subjectively, I see where we differ. I think if you drill down further, the key difference comes down to Lily Rose Depp and whether her performance is on its own captivating enough for you. I feel she did a good job. Now, there are aspects of her performance that did not work for me at all, but I don't know that it was her. I think it might have been more direction. What I mean is, one thing I love about Robert Eggers is he goes back to these old times, but they don't speak in a theatrical way, like they're standing on stage, which tends to be our understanding of those times. Because it's like if I were to go back to Shakespeare times, if people weren't constantly doing soliloquies and monologuing, I'd be like, this is weird. That's what I expect from the past, from history. And I feel like in this movie, people are generally speaking in a very naturalistic tone, except for her. She feels very theatrical to me, where she'll be speaking to her friend Anna and then turn away from her and look into the distance. The shadow comes for me and I am here in the darkness, and just speak in these very flowery way. And normally, if I'm watching an older movie where they talk in a more theatrical way, my brain sort of calibrates to it and I can enjoy it. And in fact, I might even prefer it because it's a little different from what I watch today. But when she's the only character doing it, and then later at times Von Franz, it sticks out like a sore thumb to me and doesn't work. That's one aspect of a performance that didn't work. And the other piece of it is I just thought it was repetitive. I feel like it was essentially soliloquy, cry, seizure. And it was that over and over again. And I think, go ahead.
No, and there's the other part where, like the doctors come in to see her and they're like, what is this? What could it be? And they're researching it. And it's like you and I are both saying
vampire.
It's a
vampire.
What could these bite marks be? It's a vampire.
Yeah, which is not the movie's fault. And you know what? At that, there were parts where I got restless, where I'm like, what am I supposed to be feeling now? Because I'm watching these two guys investigate, like, there's these two bite marks and there's no blood in the body. What could it be? I mean, what am I supposed to be feeling here? Because I know the answer. But the thing is, I thought about it. I watched The Exorcist. I love that movie. And a great deal of that movie is a mother trying to figure out what's happening to her daughter. And at no point did I find myself shouting at the screen, she's possessed! That's what it is. It's a demon. And I think in thinking about that helped me better understand why in Nosferatu it didn't work for me. It's the fact that it's static. Is that I did not feel that Ellen's condition worsened in that middle act. I felt, like I said, it was repetitive. And it seems like for some people, they can watch her performance and it's enough. They felt it the entire time. And she is in a very difficult position. She's going through something awful, and she has a bunch of people around her who don't believe in her and just want to literally tie her to the bed and dope her up. And I feel that for a little bit, and then eventually it just wears off. And I think what could have fixed that? And I think maybe if it started out, if it, and it did get a little bit worse because they didn't tie her to the bed at first and later they did. But if somehow I could feel the snake coiling around her more gradually and I feel her struggling against it, and so I could feel more tension. But when it just starts out with, yeah, go ahead. Help me figure this out, Daniel.
No, I mean, I think there's a thematic issue here too, which is I don't get, okay, you said the whole theme can be summed up by that scene of her screaming, he's coming, and they chloroform her, right? But they were helping her. They were trying to help her. They restrained her so she didn't hurt herself. They sedated her so she doesn't panic. It's not like if they kept her awake, she was going to explain who the he is. It's like, he's coming, and don't chloroform me so I can explain to you he's a vampire. We need to do this to solve it. Like, she wasn't gonna, you know what I mean? Like, what's it matter? She wasn't doing anything anyway, and she wasn't in her right mind. Like, I don't know that. Like, I get there's like an allegory of like, yeah, like back then people did ignore like women's health issues, whatever. Like, there's something, like there is, so I don't mean whatever. Like, I just mean etc. Right? Like, that was a thing, but it's like, that's not really what's going on here. Like, she is like possessed by a demon and hypnotized, and she's suffering, and there's like nothing she can do about it, and she's not being helpful. So like, why should I feel the tension increasing with them restraining her and stuff? Like, I would feel tension if she was about to explain to them what to do, but like, she never.
Well, I think the tension would come from the fact that, I mean, it's a little complicated by the fact that if you were to do this in real life, like, well, she's obviously not possessed by the devil. Like, there's a big problem going on here in her mind. But also, the way to help her probably isn't to just dope her up and tie her to the bed. And you also, I don't know, at least I got the feeling, especially through Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance, some of it did not come from a place of I genuinely want to help you. Some of it came from a place of, would you shut up? Get out of my house.
Maybe, I don't know, but he did a lot. Like, he went through a lot of hell to help her, you know?
You sound like him at the end of the movie. He's like, I will purchase you a wagon to leave my home at my expense, of course. People hated this. A lot of people hated his performance. I kind of loved it just because I found it amusing. You meet him early on, and he is just the most put together, you know, quote unquote rational person in the movie. And he talks like, boyo, cheerio, great to see you. And you're like, what does that person do when they run into an unequivocally supernatural force? And his unwillingness to believe, and his stubbornness, which you can understand, I just found amusing. There are moments of levity in this movie, some definitely intentional, some I wasn't sure if they were intentional, where our theater cracked up. But he was a fun character to watch. It's funny.
Well, part of why I cracked up also, though, is I think when you know what's going to happen, you get taken out of the movie, right? Like, all of a sudden you're observing it as, oh, I'm watching a movie, right? And then you see things differently than if you're like really in it.
Yeah, I go back to those two little girls who are killed. And to me, it felt like one thing that people universally seem to agree on is that this movie is not very scary. I see a lot of people say that in their reviews.
Sorry, just another thing too. It's like he says at the end, like Orlok says what he's gonna do. He's like, on the first night, this, on the second night, and it's like, so I know what's gonna happen. Like, I obviously know we're gonna get to the last night, right? We're gonna see him kill people. Like, I don't know. That was also just made it.
Well,
I'm
not fully on board with that, like what you're saying, because I don't know who he's going to kill. I don't know if there's some way to struggle against it. And I'll say that toward the end of the movie, I did start to get re-engaged, probably around that point. But it did, to some extent, feel like, okay, I'm not scaring anybody. I don't know why. Maybe it's because you've all seen this story too many times before. And so it feels like he unloaded the gun, and then once he ran out of bullets, he just threw the gun at us. And now I was like, what if I kill two innocent little girls? Is that going to disturb you guys? All right, that's not enough. Fine. But you know what their dad does after that? Defiles his wife's corpse and dies of the plague. Huh? Who's freaked out now? And so it does get to a point where it goes over the top, where you're like, I'm not feeling anything. It's just, I don't feel like, this doesn't feel like the organic way the story would go. It feels like I do this. This is what I do. I do dark. And so I'm just everybody's going to die, and it's going to be horrible. And so it has to happen that way.
Again, with like Bram Stoker's Dracula, like Van Helsing is a hero in the movie. He's a weird hero, but he is like a hero, and he advances the plot, and he's fighting to defeat Dracula. And he has like a plan. The Van Helsing in this movie isn't really that way. I guess he sort of has a plan at the end where he agrees to let
he has I would argue he has a precise plan. I mean, what you just said, that's the plan, right? He agrees to, he encourages Ellen, you're the only one who can save us. I read in the book, you have to make a sacrifice. And while you do that, I'm going to keep your husband busy by sending him on this fake quest. And I will say he's so obvious about it. He's like, yes, Thomas, go, Thomas, burn it down, Thomas. So why do you keep saying my name? And why are you being so encouraging? I was obviously going to do all that already. It's a little suspicious.
So then,
and then eventually he catches on.
But then that's kind of my issue, which is it's like they're doing all this stuff, which is sort of meaningless. It's just a distraction. All the female character, what's her name in this? Not Mina.
Ellen.
All Ellen has to do is sacrifice herself. Like there's nothing, I don't know. Like it's not, the lead up to it didn't feel cinematic, I guess. It was like a cinematic scene when, you know, he's on top of her and like sucking her blood and all this stuff. But I don't know, like the other characters, they're fighting and they're burning things. Like they're trying to do stuff. And she's like waiting in bed. Like, I don't know. It doesn't feel like a story.
Well, I think, so I almost feel like that's a compliment to the movie where it is subverting something. And it's these men are going off with their pitchforks and fires. But that's not what this situation calls for. She's doing what has to be done. I mean, she's doing something terrible because she has to spend the entire night with this corpse while it feeds on her heart and does other stuff. It's awful what she has to do, but she finds the strength to do it and vanquish this demon. And I think maybe it would have landed more for you if you had been more engaged with her journey for the entire middle section.
Yeah, which I guess that's my other confusion is like, is she hypnotized by him or not? Right? Like what? Then the journey is her making this choice to sacrifice herself. But it's like, that's not the journey that I observed. I guess that's my issue is I wasn't with her because I was just confused. Like I didn't really understand what struggle was going on within her.
Yeah, I will say there were points where, I mean, to me, it generally seemed like she could feel this evil presence worming its way into her brain, and she denied it as much as she could. And I would say she did deny that presence. I mean, she never came to him willingly until it was part of her ruse to keep him there before the first cock crows. But there were times, the one scene where she does the thing where she sticks her tongue out, that's where I'm like, what's happening?
So that's a good example of what I mean, which is just like, what is the struggle I'm observing? The struggle is to like keep her face from contorting. Like, I don't like, there's just, you know what I mean? Like there's some fundamental issue with trying to tell this story of her combating this like possession within her or whatever. Like, I don't know. I don't understand what that is.
Well, Dan, we're dealing with demonic forces that are incomprehensible to a feeble human mind like yours. But it does just feel like random. It feels like sometimes you want it to be Exorcist where Orlok is speaking through her. But if he's speaking through her, well, what's he trying to accomplish? Like berating Thomas until he goes and gets the doctor. And then she's like, oh, no, I'll be good. Wait, so you don't want him to get the doctor. Well, why'd you have her have this big convulsion in front of him, roll her eyes into the back of her head, and stick her tongue out?
Yeah. Wait, and then what is the journey she goes through? Why doesn't she sacrifice herself earlier? Like, what has to happen?
She didn't know that was a way to destroy him. Number one, she has to see the threat is to more than just herself. The threat is to the entire town. It's to everybody she knows and loves. So now the stakes are there. And now, of course, she would sacrifice herself to save all those people, but she has to know it's an option, which she learns because Von Franz finds in the book. Sees at the Maiden Fair, spends the night.
Yeah, I also didn't get that. Why did that work?
He read in a book.
But like what?
Well, basically, when the sun comes up, Orlok has to be in the dirt where he was originally buried. So if the sun comes up and he's not there, he's going to die. Why did he not be like, oh, wait a minute, I've run out of time, I got to go home? I guess, I mean, there's a lot of mystical stuff at play here. And it seems like the dark desire that she feels for him, like it seems like there is a desire in her, perhaps implanted, but she's able to fight past it and essentially compartmentalize it. It seems to me it's somewhat two-way, where he's also to some degree hypnotized by her. she has magic powers, like we established earlier. So perhaps the same way that she's enthralled by him, he's enthralled by her. So if she chooses to spend the night with him, he kind of falls under her spell as well. She's able to keep him there until morning, until the time has run out.
Yeah, I don't know. It just doesn't land. Like, I just don't. I don't know.
To me, it all comes down to that middle. I mean, a lot of what you're saying to me, I think would have worked if you and I personally were engaged by the middle portion of the movie and her story. That's my theory.
Yeah.
Well, are you excited now to start our recap?
Yeah, I was wondering if we were going to recap it.
Yeah, I mean, we've kind of jumped around a lot, but we definitely have more to say, and we have more good stuff to say too, because I will say, I found the whole first section of the movie I loved. I was actually very on board with this movie for probably about half an hour. But let's just get into it. Ellen is lonely, desperately lonely. Desperate enough to beg for the company of a guardian angel, spirit of comfort, or spirit of any celestial sphere, anything. And something answers her prayer. He beckons her outside and asks her to swear, "Shall you be one with me, shall you be one with me ever eternally?" "I swear," she answers, the unseen thing. And finally, it appears to her, a human-shaped monster. She screams and convulses. One word appears on screen. Nosferatu. And then it says years later, and I get real nervous. I'm thinking about the timeline. It's too vague. How am I going to put this on my next timeline video? But thank God, only moments later, it pops up. So Ellen wakes in the loving company of her husband, Thomas. She begs him to stay one more minute, but he must be off to work. And then it pops up on screen, Germany, 1838. And this might be the first time I can recall a movie doing a title card, like a vague one, years later, and then a second title card to clarify, Germany, 1838.
But we don't know. We don't know the initial year.
Yeah, how many years was it?
Actually, that was another random thing I was confused by, because, when he says, like, she's committed to him eternally or whatever, I thought, like, oh, so does she have, like, eternal life or whatever? And was that, like, 100 years earlier? I don't know that it really matters, but I was wondering that at that point.
Yeah, if, like, can he turn her, make her a vampire?
Which also isn't something we saw in this movie, right? She doesn't, like, start to turn into a vampire. But we did get that in Bram Stoker's.
Yeah, which was fun. At the office, Thomas is met with good news. His superior, Herr Knock, assigns him a new client, one that promises generous wages. That client? Count Orlok, who wishes to acquire a home here in Wisburg, in which to retire. He has one foot in the grave, so to speak. That's what Knock says. He that really tickled him. And if I was Orlok, I'd be like, "Would you shut up? Like, it's supposed to be a secret that I'm undead." Anybody who hears you say that is going to be like, "Why do you think that was so funny? Wait a minute, you're saying he's a vampire? Count Orlok's a Nosferatu?" He's like, "No, I didn't say anything, nothing." The Count is eccentric and infirm, too infirm to travel, so Thomas must travel to him, to a small country by the name of Transylvania. Can the Count not execute the deed once he arrives here? Thomas asks. No, Knock tells him. He insists we offer him an agent in the flesh. And again, Orlok is like, "Dude, shut up. Stop with these double entendres. You're not as clever as you think you are." It reminds me, I've complained about this so many times, but when Better Call Saul was on, these writers that were working on the show, they kept saying stuff thinking they were being sly. And I'm like, we all know what you're saying. They're like, "Well, I don't want to spoil anything, but I would just say I probably wouldn't let yourself get too attached to this character. Because next episode, they might have some trouble, and you might not see them again after that." I'm like, yeah, we're reading between the lines. We know. Well, anyway, going to see Count Orlok, it's important. It's an incredible opportunity for Thomas's career. Of course, Thomas will accept the assignment. Ellen begs him not to go. She had a dream that portends something awful. Thomas does not wish to hear it. He tries to remind her what the doctors said, but she will tell him the dream, whether he likes it or not. It was their wedding, but darkened by storm clouds, and at the altar, Thomas was not there, but instead, Death, dressed all in black. And Ellen was happy. She embraced Death, and when they turned around, everyone was dead. And she has never been more happy. Thomas hugs her, he looks at her, and he tells her, never speak these things aloud. That was probably the first laugh in our theater, because it looks like he's being comforting, and then he's just like, don't ever say any of that crazy stuff again. And I will say I found that intriguing. It's just a very weird thing to say, that I saw everybody dead. I was with death, but I was happy. And I think it's a very difficult thing to capture on screen, and I think it's partly why the middle act of the movie struggled for me. But how do you portray somebody who feels happiness and feels love for a horrible thing, but knows that it's an implanted feeling, and they have a mental struggle against it? That's what I think they're trying to portray, and all of that's happening in her mind, so it comes out externally as seizures and sticking your tongue out and shaking your arms, which, became repetitive to me. But the idea is interesting. Yeah, and then there's another laugh, too, where she's like, you mustn't leave. I love you too much. Smash cut to both of them looking miserable in a wagon. And I think just any time you have such a hard cut with such a contrast, it's just hard not to be comedic. Because it reminds me of Arrested Development. I could just imagine the narration. She begged him to stay. He didn't. Yeah. Before setting off, Thomas brings his wife to Frederick Harding's home. Frederick and his wife Anna have agreed to let Ellen stay with them for a few weeks while her husband is away. And it's already a full house. They have 2 young daughters and another on the way. The house is in high spirits until Thomas risks sullying the mood. He asks Frederick to look after Ellen, as he fears her melancholy may be returning. So I think, at this point in the movie, some of the stuff we talked about that I love, but Eggers, the strong suit everybody talks about is how great a job he does at portraying, doing the period piece thing. Because like I said, he strips away a lot of the romanticism, and he tries to alter reality, I think, only as much as necessary to allow for the story to happen. So he pushes reality only as far as he needs to for a Count Orlok, Nosferatu, to exist. And I feel like up to this point in the movie, we're seeing that. And then some of what we already talked about. She's pregnant. They have 2 daughters. I know they're all going to die. Is that a problem? I'll leave it for viewers and listeners to contemplate that. Elsewhere, Herr Knock sits nude in a pentagram while ranting wildly about how everything is going according to plan. It seems he has made a pact with Orlok, including a promise to send him Thomas. Thomas promises... Well, we can pause there for a second. That was an interesting change. So as much as we know the story already, it was interesting to see what changes Eggers made. So essentially, Knock, Thomas's supervisor, has become the Renfield character. But Renfield, I actually felt like in 1992 Dracula, the Renfield character was kind of pointless. And he was an interesting addition, and I enjoyed Tom Waits' performance in that role. But when they aired that movie on TV, they often cut his scenes, and I can understand why, because they don't really progress the plot forward in any way. But here, Knock is working with Orlok and sends him Thomas because he's his supervisor.
Yeah, so I did like that change. It added just another character driving the plot forward, and a villain that, again, he's also like hypnotized or whatever, but like a villain that they can like fight against.
Right.
That's like
Which I love. Jumping ahead, I do love. No, I won't go into the details of it, but I love the way he's taken out of the movie. Thomas promises Ellen he will write her every day. He reminds her that he is doing this all for them both. And he leaves. And where have we heard that before? I'm doing it for my family. I'm doing it for you. I'm doing it for us. The excuse of every anti-hero of the last 20 years. Breaking Bad, etc. Near Count Orlok's castle, Thomas finds shelter at an inn where he is warned never to speak the name of that count and to stay away from that castle. That night, he witnesses a strange ritual. The townsfolk bring a nude virgin on horseback to a vampire's grave. They open the coffin and plunge a blade into the chest of a living corpse. Thomas startles awake in bed. Was it only a dream? The mud on his shoes says otherwise.
So this sequence was cool. This was really cool,
go.
and it kept my attention. I really liked it. One question, wait, so there are other vampires?
Seems so.
That was something that always confused me about Dracula, because I'm so used to like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer or a True Blood where, you know, vampirism is like a virus. It spreads to different people. And actually in Bram Stoker's Dracula too, he makes other vampires. So it always confuses me when it's like a thing that other people can also be, or it's like there's just Dracula. Which confuses me.
Yeah. Well, I love the explanation in 1992's Dracula where he just pronounces, I will be eternal. I will drink the blood. Blood is the life. And then he just becomes a vampire. Like he just declares it. Yeah, but I guess there's other vampires. And Orlok, he doesn't like to talk about it. Or he doesn't like to talk about the local people's traditions. Because I guess to him it's offensive. They're killing vampires. But a couple things I love about this I'll add. I feel like these scenes, we've seen it so many times, and it comes off as goofy anytime you try to do it. You better stay away from that castle. They whisper awful things about that castle. But here, I feel like it was done so deadly serious that it felt like, you know what? I would actually listen to these people. In other movies, I'd be like, you crazy old, get away from me. You don't know what you're talking about. But here, they really sold it. It didn't come off as cartoonish.
Well, and we talked about how, like, in Lord of the Rings, War of the Rohirrim, we talked about how, like, there's this one character there who, she's like an old, like, witch, and she talks weird. And it's always like, why are you talking weirdly? Just explain what you mean. Say it in plain terms so I can understand you. In this case, they're speaking weirdly because they speak a different language. That was a good way to solve it.
Exactly. So, the next day, he walks to a desolate crossing where he is met by a horse-drawn carriage. Though for a moment, it looks almost as though there is only a carriage, drawn by something invisible, and it brings him to Count Orlok's castle. Though it is past the midnight hour, Count is impatient. He insists on taking care of the deed tonight. As they speak, Thomas's nerves get the better of him, and when he accidentally cuts himself on a bread knife, discomfort turns to panic as Orlok slowly approaches. A few things. Some stuff, I'm like, at this point, I'm loving the movie. The one moment I can't get out of my head is when he first sees that carriage, and it looks like I described it. It was like a desolate forest and this ghostly carriage in front of him. And you can see he's starting to get nervous, which is really effective because up to this point, he's been this very, you know, like I said earlier, it could come across as naive, but almost just optimistic. It's a great career opportunity. I don't want to leave my wife behind, but I'm doing it for us. It's going to be great. There's nothing to worry about. And to see him start to get nervous is effective. And there is dread as you approach the castle. I also just never get tired of seeing a castle on a hill in the different ways people portray it. But the kind of dark blue sky behind it, the silhouette of the castle. And then once you get inside the castle, you have the pillars. And then behind it, the fireplace. And those pillars just felt like something ancient. And it felt this place feel like a very important ancient place. And obviously the soundtrack. There's just random screeching, very foreboding music. And seeing Thomas, he's nervous. And then once he cuts himself and Dracula's approaching, he's out and out just panicking. He's crying. And very effective, I thought. Some weird Dracula stuff. 1992's take did it by having the shadow kind of be out of sync with the person moving. This one does some similar things, He's like, "Let me pour you a drink," and suddenly he's at his shoulder. He's right at his side, as if he kind of teleported / floated there. What did you think of the Nosferatu voice? That's the talk of the town right now.
It was good. I liked it.
Kind of reminded me of Splinter from Ninja Turtles, but louder, which I thought was a very good choice.
The name Orlok is so like I mean Nosferatu really just ripped off Dracula. Like that's so on the nose. Orlok. It's like almost all the same letters.
Yeah, and it's also Nosferatu just means vampire, and I think that they used the term in the Dracula book. I mean, obviously it didn't work. You know, they got one of history's first copyright claims. We're demonetized.
We are never mind.
I just love, this movie is trying to do the thing of the more unknown the danger is, the creepier it can be. And as soon as you have a demon or a dark thing that's speaking in coherent full sentences, it risks ripping it out of the realm of the unknown and saying, oh, it's just a weird human. I thought this movie did a great job of keeping it in that kind of unknown place. The way that he's always drowned in darkness. You never get a great look at his face. Because they were worried if you saw the mustache, nobody would take it seriously. The mustache has actually been a great point of contention for a lot of viewers. But had no problem with the mustache.
By the way, until this point in the movie, because we still haven't seen his face, and because I know Willem Dafoe is in the movie, I thought Willem Dafoe is the vampire.
Yeah, I knew it wasn't it's Bill Skarsgård, who is he's becoming the I forget the name I was going to say, so I'm not going to say it. The blank of our time. This classic actor, Lon Chaney, who would disappear into a lot of monstrous roles. Because Skarsgård, he's been Pennywise, now he's Count Orlok, and he's been other things. He does a great job in this role. So between keeping him darkened at all times, and giving him this very inhuman voice that's very monotone, it's kind of more centered on the... It's louder and more projected than everybody else's voice, so it feels almost disembodied. I think they did a great job. Because how do you outdo... If you see the original Count Orlok from Nosferatu, very creepy. Not shrouded in darkness, you can see him. But how do you outdo that? Or how do you avoid just mimicking that? And I think he found a great solution. Back home, Ellen has a soliloquy by the sea about how sad she is and how she feels someone or something else now has power over her. This is the scene that kind of is where I started to... Go ahead. I see you applauding over there.
No, just soliloquy by the sea. I'm very impressed. Did you come up with
Thank
that,
you.
Gil?
I did, because that's how it felt to me. It felt like suddenly we were doing a play, and I felt like... This is what I was talking about earlier. I hated the acting in this scene because it broke me from the movie's spell, where suddenly it was doing the thing that I was so glad the movie wasn't doing. I mean, she's looking out into the distance. She's doing that. First off, nobody does this in real life. When you're talking to somebody, you turn your back to them. Go ahead.
I do that. I do that all the time.
I've never seen you do it. You turn your back on somebody and start speaking into the distance. Does it ever call to you, urge you, something is close at hand, destiny? And like maybe that's just a personal problem, but I hear that and I'm like, I cringe.
So one other random thing is, just comparing to Bram Stoker's again, but the who is Mina's friend in Bram Stoker's?
I forget her name.
But she was like more of a character in Bram Stoker's. Like, and they do stuff together and they have like a friendship and all that. Like, and it was kind of engaging and they had some like fun, interesting scenes. And she was just kind of a fun character on her own. And like, and was part of the theme too. And then obviously stuff happens to her. She turns into a vampire and all this. Like in this movie, the mother of those two little girls, like she's not really much of a character. And I don't find her interactions with the main woman very interesting either.
Yeah, I know she's feeding into the theme because she's the only one taking Ellen seriously. And when Frederick gets frustrated and will tell him this. I forget the word she uses, but the illness is not her doing, so you can't be frustrated with her and all that. But yeah, I think she is less of a character than Mina's friend was in 1992's Take. And yeah, just speaking in metaphors, speaking very theatrically. It's also just, and maybe it would have worked for me if it was more dynamic, but now we've entered everyone's a puppet mode. And this mood that is being portrayed, the vibe of the movie, it like her character is essentially static, like I was saying earlier, and it doesn't feel like it's sinking deeper into a hole. It just feels like it's the same mood, and I think that's. I guess I'm starting to repeat myself, so I'll move on from that.
I've pulled up the cast list in front of me, so I stopped referring to Ellen as the woman. It's Ellen and her friend Anna. All right. Thomas.
All right,
I got this.
there you go. Speaking of Thomas, in Transylvania, under the light of the morning sun, Thomas wakes on the floor in a stupor. He finds a mirror and finds small punctures on the front of his shirt, as though something fed upon him.
What could that be? What could it be?
That night, Orlok asks Thomas to sign those papers, which are written in a language the young man does not recognize. So, Enochian, by the way, a sort of constructed language associated with the occult. The language of Orlok's forefathers. And something catches the Count's eye. Thomas's locket containing some of Ellen's hair. Orlok takes it, doesn't give it back. He's like, "Can I see that for a second?" And later, Thomas is like, "You never give back that locket." And he just ignores him. But Orlok does give Thomas his commission, those promised wages, and Thomas, with a shaking hand, signs his name. After this, Thomas intends to leave. He fears he has fallen ill, which may explain the strange dreams he's been having. But Orlok insists, nay, he commands that Thomas stay. The next morning, Thomas wakes up again, and again he finds puncture wounds on his bare chest. Searching for a way off castle grounds, he stumbles upon a tomb, and inside it, a coffin. And inside it, the living corpse of Count Orlok. The nude living corpse, I should add, because you see it. And I saw a picture of Bill Skarsgård posing with the prosthetic that he wore. Thomas attempts to replicate that ritual he saw, impaling the nude vampire when he wakes. But when the vampire wakes, Thomas runs, chased by a wolf. Orlok in his tomb whispers to the locket, to Ellen, "Your husband is lost to you. Dream of me, only me."
I like these scenes. I love this is another thing maybe I shouldn't have laughed at, but I think I laughed when he, when Thomas is saying he needs to go home, he thinks he's not feeling well, and Orlok is like, "No, he's bad to travel when you are infirm." Like, it's just when, you're trying to be polite to somebody, you're coming up with an excuse, you're like, "Look, I gotta get home to do whatever," and they're just tone deaf to it. I don't know, I found it really funny.
It just, you're trying to be polite and you're throwing the bait out there and they just keep smacking it away.
But, I would have liked to see more interesting things in the castle. Like, we didn't see that much like interesting, kooky stuff happening.
I'd say we saw one thing that I found pretty interesting, which is that this castle seems to be abandoned. At least in the light of day, it looks decrepit, and that feels a lot creepier to me than, again, if we go back to the 1992 Take, where it's a bit more bustling, because he has his wives there. There's some, it may be undead, but life in the castle, and I thought this worked. In terms of trying to make a scarier movie, I thought this worked better. There's also a great visual where Orlok is in his tomb, and Thomas is outside, but the camera is slowly zooming in on Thomas, and you see the shadow of Orlok approaching as if he's walking up to Thomas, and then his hand kind of moves up and snaps. And then Thomas opens the tomb and reveals Orlok inside it. So the shadow is essentially a visual representation of him kind of mind controlling Thomas. They do great stuff with Orlok's shadow in this movie. There's another visual later where you see his hand kind of moving over the entire city. Looks amazing. I also love when Orlok is feeding on Thomas, and you get you get a glimpse of the back of his head, and it looks like a rotting corpse. There's like holes in his skull. It's absolutely disgusting, which I think is impressive. Making vampires disgusting. It's been a long time since we saw that. When Orlok approaches Thomas, it briefly cuts to Ellen nude, as if she's the one approaching Thomas, which I think is just meant to give the vibe of what it feels like to be in Orlok's clutches. It feels like you're being seduced. And then he bites your heart and starts sucking out your blood.
And I guess it's also interesting because it's also partly because Ellen is like possessed by Orlok. It's also partly that she herself is hunting Thomas, and she herself feels some of the guilt, right, for tormenting him.
Yeah. She knows that she's the one who invited this dark force into their lives so many years ago. In Germany, Dr. Wilhelm Sievers attempts to treat Ellen for her recent somnambulism, sleepwalking. He gives her ether, recommends she wear a corset to encourage proper posture and circulation, and he tells Frederick, well, if her condition worsens, you could always tie her to the bed. And this is where you have the moment I talked about earlier, where he's suffocating her with the ether. There's so many great visual moments in the movie, but here you see Frederick and Anna talking on this foggy beach, and just that backdrop. All I have to say about it is it looks great, which is also in the moment all I have to think about it, which is why maybe I need more than just visuals. Go ahead.
I love when Dr. Sivers says to what's the other guy's
Frederick.
name? To Frederick, he says to him, and don't worry about it, just put it out your mind. And it's like we know this is not something that's going to go away.
Well, it's like Dr. Sievers is showing more empathy to Frederick for having to deal with Ellen than he's actually showing to Ellen. Another morning comes. Thomas finds himself face to face with Orlok's wolves, runs out a window and finds himself on the snowy castle ledge, and he slips off it. Into waters below. In Germany, Frederick is losing patience. Ellen worries for Thomas, and despite Frederick's assurances that her husband is fine, her panic and worry will not be quashed, nor will her seizures. Soon, Dr. Sievers will pay her another visit, but first he receives a new patient. This one is stowed in one of their basement cells, the inhumane ones they no longer use. But this patient is an exception. A madman who killed 3 sheep with his bare hands. They found him eating them raw. I love that guy's delivery. Remember that moment where he brings him in and he's telling Sievers why he locked him in that cell? Raw. You see the terror in his eyes. That madman, his name is Herr Knock. That's Thomas's supervisor. He's finally snapped. And he is quite excited at the prospect of his master's arrival. Count Orlok's arrival. Also, Ellen has another seizure. I don't know if I have more to say here. It's a lot of what I was saying already. It almost starts to, even with Knock, at this point, I'm starting to get frustrated at how Ellen has become a zombie. And now I'm like, oh, and here's a guy acting wacky and just screaming and going crazy. And then cut to Anna and Ellen, and Frederick is like, could you please be quiet, Ellen? And they walk away, and then she just starts screaming again and having another seizure. And the movie just starts to feel like a lot of people acting wacky. And I'm like, let's just go to the next story thing. What the hell is wrong with her? Well, Dr. Sievers knows someone who might be able to help. Dr. Van Helsing. I mean, Albin Erbhart von Franz. A very smart man who was tossed out of his university and laughed out of his home country for his obsession with the occult. But Sievers fears he is the only one who may have answers. In Transylvania, Thomas lives. He is rescued by a group of nuns at a church and nursed back to health. They beg him to stay for his own well-being, but he knows the Count is after Ellen, so he rushes back home. There's a moment here I love where Thomas wakes up and they're telling him, you have to stay. And he's like just getting his breath back and only manages to get out that one line, he seeks after Ellen, I know it! Just the pure terror and panic in his voice. And it's not inert because he's about to take action and rush back home. So this is where the movie, to me, starts to feel like we're starting to get momentum. It's starting to re-engage me a little bit. Orlok rushes home too, to his new home. He stows in a crate on a ship and calls on a storm to bring winds to hasten his trip. And undoubtedly, not coincidentally, the ship is plagued by the plague. But soon, Ellen is not alone, because Sievers brings in von Franz. He quickly admonishes them for doping her up and tying her up, and he begins his first consultation. For the first time, someone takes her story seriously. She tells him about her childhood. Her spells are like dreams that tell her things. She always knew the contents of her Christmas gifts. She knew when her mother would pass. Things got worse as she got older. She frightened her father. She was so alone after that, she wished for comfort. But once she met Thomas, things were normal. Until now, the visions and night wanderings have returned. What do you think of this take on Van Helsing? Willem Dafoe's take?
It felt far too similar to the Bram Stoker's Van Helsing. And so to me, it didn't feel unique. It just felt like off-brand Van Helsing. And I love Willem Dafoe, but I don't know. I also feel like they didn't give him that much screen time. I don't know. I felt like he could have done more, and he didn't really do that much.
Yeah, I mean, he was kind of fun just seeing Willem Dafoe cut loose. But I didn't really get his character. There's a moment later where I'm like, I don't really get why he's doing that. And so we'll get to that shortly. But I thought he was great. During Ellen's next spell, von Franz speaks to her, and she replies as though possessed with demonic ramblings. His prognosis? She is cursed, possessed by a demon. As Orlok's ship approaches, Nock bites his guard and escapes into the night, running with the unmistakable gait of a madman. You know, kind of like a gorilla where your arms are swinging like crazy. But first, Thomas arrives, barely conscious on his horse. And then Orlok's ship crashes on shore, letting loose a swarm of plague-ridden rats.
That was really cool. And when they say, it's a plague ship, and they're like terrified, I thought that it was just, there were like a few things in the movie that were really cool. And the plague ship was really cool. And the whole sequence of the whole town becoming infected was awesome. And it was kind of gripping.
Yeah, and this is also where the story starts to forge its own path in certain ways. I don't know exactly what's going to happen at this point. So I definitely felt more engaged, and things are now moving. Things are happening. Like when you see Sievers Hospital overrun by patients and needs to turn people away. The next morning, with Thomas's return, Ellen seems back to her old self. Though he is barely awake and bedridden, maybe, Anna suggests, the professor was wrong. There is no demon. But the bodies examined by Sievers and von Franz suggest otherwise. The bodies they found on the ship, the ones entirely drained of blood with puncture marks.
What could it be?
It's a vampire. This is also the moment where Orlok holds his hand up and the shadow just starts to move over the city. Amazing shot. That same night, Sievers and Frederick meet with the professor, who lays plain what they are dealing with. It's a vampire, Nosferatu. There's a great line here that got a big laugh in our theater. I have seen things in this world that would have made Isaac Newton crawl back into his mother's womb. That vampire is presently visiting Ellen in her dreams. She called for him all those years ago, and now she has become his affliction. But he needs her to come to him of her own will. She may as well. After all, Thomas signed her over in exchange for nothing more than a small sack of gold. The implication being that the documents, the deed that he signed, written in that other language, was actually divorce papers.
It doesn't really seem fair.
Yeah, thankfully it doesn't really work. It just does. It's like great. You trick them. Like, you don't really understand how the world works. You can't just trick someone into signing a document that's like, you love me now. It's like, you got it. It doesn't work that way, Warlock. Well, okay, plan B. All right, fine. I'm going to kill someone tonight. And that's night 1. I'm going to give you 3 nights to come to me. And every night you don't, I'm going to kill more people. Night 3, I'm going to kill your beloved Thomas. And then she wakes up to see who's first on the list. A bunch of rats eating the unborn child in Anna's womb. Ugh. And the morning greets a town overrun by plague. Severs is forced to turn away patients with the hospital already overflowing. And then Anna kind of has become Ellen, where she speaks very theatrically. Shadows, suffocating, suffocating. Tell me, what is this insufferable darkness?
It's a vampire.
Yeah. At his wit's end, Frederick kicks Ellen and Thomas out of his home. Meanwhile, Severs and von Franz search for the Nosferatu. Not Herr Knock, but he has made contact with it. So they search his office and they find an old book, the pentagram on the floor, all the markings of a man cavorting with the devil, which was the original title of this movie. But how do you kill that infernal beast? The professor tells them that he doesn't know. He's never encountered a Nosferatu firsthand, and methods vary greatly from region to region. Their efficacy is plainly unknown. But there is one common thread. The Nosferatu must return to the earth wherein it was buried by first crow of cock. The next morning, Thomas wakes, finally, and Ellen tells him her secret. How she inadvertently called on the vampire years ago, he took her as his lover, and now he has returned. At first, she's ashamed, but then she turns on Thomas. Like, you're a wimp. You suck. And then she has a seizure, sticks her tongue out of her mouth. It's all practical effects, which everyone keeps pointing out. It's amazing. She stuck her tongue out. I will admit, the way her body shakes in like very unnatural ways is genuinely impressive and was probably not very comfortable.
I do have to say, for her facial expressions, I kind of think they should have done some CGI or some type of practical effects. It looked really stupid.
Well, it just looks like a person just messing around.
Yeah.
And then it got laughs in our theater, and sometimes I get really frustrated when the audience laughs, and I'm like, oh, it's a horror movie, but you don't want to take it seriously because you're uncomfortable, so you're laughing. But maybe this was intentionally funny, but she's kind of like berating Thomas. And but then when she starts to kind of seize and her tongue is sticking out of her mouth, he is like, I'm going to go get the doctor. And then she quickly changes her tune. No. I'll be good. Because it does make it seem like she's faking it. I know she's not. But that's like the language of the scene is I'm going to act all wacky. But then as soon as you're going to go get the doctor, I'm like, no, I'm good. And then it's just, in which case, if the demon, if Orlok is kind of speaking through her, what was the angle there? What was she trying to accomplish? And that's where it feels like what you were saying earlier. It just doesn't feel like there's an internal logic to the struggle happening in her mind sometimes. And it just, after Knock is like rolling around naked in his pentagram and waving his arms around, and then she's doing it. Just sometimes the movie goes into that mode. It's just a bunch of people acting wacky.
So here's an example where in Bram Stoker's, like, Mina goes through some character development. And like part of what happens, right, is there is part of, first of all, she did like love who became Count Dracula in a past life, right? And there is sort of romantic tension. And part of one of the themes is her actual sort of underlying desire that's being inhibited by society, right? So maybe something that could have happened in this movie is, yeah, maybe these things she's saying to Thomas, like maybe these are things she actually feels or means, right? What's really happening is this possession is her giving into her own darker side, but it is a real side of her. But like the issue is that's like just not what's happening. It's just like it's like Nosferatu just doing stuff through her. Right? Like, I don't know. Something like that would have made her character more sort of psychological and interesting and more agentic.
Yeah. What's that word mean?
Agentic?
Mm-hmm.
Like have agency, like driving the plot, doing things, being a person.
I see. Yeah, which this movie is praised for giving her more agency. And I think it does. And I do think it's interesting, but it feels like there's a large swath of the movie where that agency is only there to be subverted. Well, Ellen taunts Thomas, "You could never please me as Orlok could." Thomas takes that as a challenge, and they become physically intimate. Until she has another episode. She warns him that the monster will kill him if she does not go to Orlok. Thomas assures her he will kill that monster. How? Von Franz may finally have an answer, but it's one he cannot share with Thomas, because the book spells it out. A maiden fair offers her love, keeping the Nosferatu in her embrace until the first cock crows. Through her willing sacrifice, the curse is broken, and Nosferatu is vanquished. But that Nosferatu made a promise. He was going to do some killing. That night, it's Anna's turn, along with her 2 young daughters. The next day, they devise a plan. They will sanctify the place where Nosferatu was buried, so he has no earth to return to. They will destroy his sarcophagus, and Thomas will drive a spike of cold iron through him. But 2 among them know the cold truth. There is only one way to kill this Nosferatu. A willing sacrifice by a certain fair maiden. Von Franz and Ellen know this, but allow Thomas to believe otherwise.
Oh, wait, is that why we saw that ritual at the beginning of the movie where they have that woman on horseback? Was she the sacrifice in order to kill that vampire?
I don't know, to be honest. It's a good question, yeah, because if they're going to kill it by driving a spike through his heart or whatever, what was the point of the maiden or the virgin? Was it to awaken him so they could kill him? Or was the stake? Yeah, what was the point of the stake?
I mean, it sounds like you need both, right? Like it's not sufficient to stake him. Like you need a sacrifice also. Maybe you need the sacrifice to distract him, but that's not what they do. And yeah, I don't know. That's why I also found the ending confusing, because I didn't really understand why she needed to sacrifice herself.
Yeah, it wouldn't be confusing if not for that earlier scene.
Yeah.
They send Thomas on a false hunt as a diversion, while she will lay with the beast. And it works. But first, the bereaved Frederick defiles his wife's corpse and dies of plague.
Why does he do that?
Because I think he's just driven mad by grief. And when I say defile, well, okay, I guess up for you see him kiss her corpse.
Yeah.
I've seen other people say it's clear necrophilia happened. I think when you find him, he's in a state of undress. I'm not sure. So that's why I was trying to put it politely. So I said the word defile. But yeah, I think he just went mad with grief, essentially. He just couldn't handle it. The end. I kind of rushed through the ending there. I realized as I was like recapping the movie, I kind of realized I was going way too slow. So then I was like, let me just wrap this up here. A couple things. So talking about the ending. I will say they did not fully have me convinced that the only way to kill Nosferatu, to your point, was to sacrifice Ellen. This is another moment. Go ahead.
Well, did they ever try? Like, I'm just thinking in Bram Stoker's, they fight Dracula a few times. Like, they try to stop him. It didn't really seem like they tried much.
Yeah. It also, not only did they not try different methods, but he says, many different regions have different methods. We don't know which one works. But as soon as he finds the one that requires us to kill Ellen, this is the one that works. I mean, presumably, again, if many regions have different methods, it can't just be because it's written in a book. That means it definitely works. And this is where I, to some extent, feel the hand of the filmmaker, which is she has to die. She has to sacrifice herself.
But why not? Like, why not actually have them fight Dracula? They're trying to kill him. He kills some of them. He's about to kill Thomas. And then Ellen intervenes to sacrifice herself and save him. Like, you could have made that happen.
You could have, and I don't think I don't think you have to do that for this story. I think a version of this story works just fine. Again, it's weird because I think I've seen a few articles that praise Eggers for not being beholden to theme, where he just takes the story organically where it would go. But in a way, I feel like he is beholden to theme in this movie. I feel like he needed her to sacrifice herself, weaponizing the sexuality between her and Nosferatu. He needed that. And so he manipulated events to get there. But I feel like there is a way to do that that would have felt more organic to me. I mean, like we were going back to Thomas saw them kill a vampire earlier in the movie. Maybe they didn't kill it, but it certainly was implied because they stab it and it spits up a bunch of blood. And when Orlok dies here, you see him spit up a bunch of blood. It was just weird to me. And I do think it could have worked. To me, it felt very strange.
No, I don't know. It's just another time where it's like Eggers, very talented. All these actors, very good. The writer's good. I mean, like, I think, like, everything was good. You know, technically very capable. Like, why? I don't know. Why not tell a different story? Like, I don't know. Like, why did they tell this one? Like,
yeah. Going back to Von Franz too, what I was saying earlier, I just don't fully get his character because he seems pretty empathetic to what's happening here. Like he really wants to help everybody and do the right thing. And then they find the caskets and Orlok isn't there. Instead, they find Knock, which I did love that moment because they open the casket. And yeah, of course, you don't hesitate. You stab whatever's in there. And he just, Thomas immediately stabs and, oh no, it's not Orlok, it's Knock. And he's just like, whoa! But Thomas realizes it's all a diversion. And he's like, he's with my wife. I need to run back to her. And Von Franz starts laughing at him. Ha ha ha! In vain you run. You cannot outrun destiny. And then he turns to the fires. Redemption! Why are you laughing at? What's funny about this? His wife is now sacrificing herself, having this terrible night of passion while having her heart consumed with a corpse. And to Von Franz, this is just tickling him. And I guess he's being like crazy and like I'm wacky, but it just didn't make sense. It didn't fit for me. And they did this to some extent. I don't know why I always forget this amazing actor's name, but who played Van Helsing in Dracula 1992?
Oh yeah, I keep forgetting.
I don't know why I always forget. Anthony Hopkins.
Yeah.
He did a bit of this too, but it wasn't just in one scene. From the beginning, you could see how excited he was to actually face the occult. And he's been studying this all his life, and now he gets to actually encounter a vampire. And it never fully overrode, I think, his sympathy for the people that were actually in that vampire's clutches. But you could see there was a push-pull of I'm here to help people, but also, wow, a Nosferatu, this is amazing. But I didn't really get that impression with Von Franz. And then all of a sudden here, he is just, this is hilarious. This Thomas is trying to save his wife, but he doesn't know that he's too late. He's not going to be able to stop it. What an idiot. It didn't work for me. Very cool shot, though. When they are burning, like they're burning some bodies or something, and they're holding up a torch, and then it kind of transitions to another scene where they're holding the torch to light their way on a boat floating downriver in the city. And it's like bathed in that dark blue. It looked amazing. And I mean, I thought the final scene between Orlok and Ellen was pretty incredible. Again, this is the most gruesome we've seen him feed. So we've seen how he goes into your chest cavity, but now there's like literally a hole in her chest. So it's like he's eating her down to her heart. Looks disgusting. I love that he didn't just burst into flames or vaporize when he saw the sun. Blood explodes out of his eyes and mouth, and you just sort of see life drain out of him. And to me, it felt, if you're trying to tell a more If you're trying to alter reality, like I said earlier, just enough to allow this story to happen, this feels like a more grounded approach to a vampire dying instead of like, you've seen different versions of it, vaporizing, rapidly aging into dust. This felt equally powerful, but a bit more grounded. So yeah, I liked that ending moment. Well, we've reached the end here, and it's been you can hear the struggle in my voice. Part of me has felt like I'm missing out on something. Like I'm seeing some of the greatness that other people are seeing, but I'm not feeling the greatness. And I think we've already talked through where my experience with this movie differs from others, so I don't need to restate all of it. I mean, one thing I did find myself wondering is, one measure of how successful a movie is for you personally is how engaged it kept you for the runtime. But there's different ways to measure the success of a movie, because there could be a film that keeps you engaged for 2 hours. You're entertained for 2 hours. But then you walk away and you never think about it again. It's totally, what's the word I'm looking for? Like junk food, candy. Then there's movies that keep you engaged the entire time and they linger. Images you can't get out of your head, ideas that you continue to think about long after you walk out of the theater. But this movie falls into an interesting category where on the engaging front, for a lot of it, not very engaging for me. But interestingly, on the other side of it, there are visuals that will stay with me. The movie will have a longer lasting impact in my mind and in my heart than movies that kept me engaged all the way through. And so sometimes that makes me wonder if I need to like find a different way to watch movies, appreciate a movie, even if I'm quote unquote bored.
But what is the significance of, let's say, an image staying in your head from a movie? Like, what meaning does that have?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and to me, probably just an image staying in your mind. That's almost, it could be a side note. It's like, oh, I didn't love the movie, but the cinematographer did a great job. Or the work between the director and cinematographer. They did a great job in coming up with a very striking image. But what if you take it a step further and you say the images stay in your mind, but so do the ideas? And so the movie could have failed on one level to be engaging the entire time, but it did succeed in another. But I don't know, for me personally, it's always been that can be true. But if you're kind of weighing how good a movie is it, I put definitely more weight on how engaging is it. Like that's more important to me than that second layer. And partly because if you have ideas you want people to engage with, they're probably not going to engage with them if the movie itself isn't engaging. That's how you get them to focus and pay attention to those ideas. And also, if you just want ideas, you can just talk about them. But movies are more effective because they add emotional weight to those ideas. So they stay inside you longer.
That's part of what I'm thinking about, like the integration of narrative, theme, and like the form, right? Like the imagery, right? Like the value of an image staying in your head is when it's like imbued with meaning through the theme, right? So let's say maybe if that image of her being chloroformed while she's screaming, right? Like if that image sticks out to you and it's tied to a theme, like that's significant, right? Like the art has like done something for you. I don't know. I mean, but I feel like I feel like a great movie, it integrates all those things and more sticks with you than just one image. Like the image and the story and the theme. I don't know. Like it's like more of it will stick with you.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, what are we even trying to figure out here? Like, what label do you put on it? Good, great. You don't really need to put a label. You can just plainly say that for us personally, didn't find the movie engaging from beginning to end. For portions of it, we did. But it succeeded in other respects. Like that image does stay with me. And I do think it integrated some themes that emotionally resonated. If you were to translate it to real life, it's essentially, imagine any time in your life where somebody has some kind of affliction and you feel impatient with them and you want to be like, leave me alone, be quiet. to me, this movie is that feeling turned up to 100, because that's what they're doing to Ellen, and it's to hers and everyone else's detriment. That is the impetus of all of this happening, because that's what happened to her when she was younger. That's what drove her into isolation and desperation. That's what invited Orlok into their lives. And I think that's...
Well, that's interesting, though. So as I was trying to analyze what makes like a movie, I was also thinking, though, of the difference between propaganda and art, right? Like propaganda is trying to get a certain message to you. And what you just described in a certain way is like more propaganda than art, right? Like what would really make it art is if you felt it, right? Like, I don't know, like if you experience that feeling of that sort of oppression as you watch the movie, right? And I guess it's like, I didn't feel that. And so to me, I don't know.
I did feel it, but the feeling just essentially wore. I became numb to it over time because I didn't feel like the feeling was dynamic. It just sort of was, and then it was, and then it was until the end. So I definitely wouldn't say I didn't. Yeah, I guess I'm just repeating myself. There's a whole conversation to be had about the difference between art and propaganda, because I would actually disagree slightly.
Yeah.
Where you said the difference is, do you feel it? I mean, with propaganda, definitely the hope is that you're going to feel it. The difference is largely intent, right? It's almost one man's propaganda could be somebody else's art. Intent's part of it. We can get it. There's a whole conversation to be had about that. Part of its limitation, where you are limiting the movie to one singular point of view, because there are movies that can be very meaningful, but they don't have a particular message. It's more giving you the raw material you need to think about something you haven't thought about. And there's many different conclusions you can come to, but it's opened up an avenue for you to consider and feel. Propaganda is not about opening an avenue. It's about pushing you in a very specific direction.
Well, my hope then is that every year around New Year's, people will watch Nosferatu and have a conversation about what film is supposed to be.
There you go.
As a terrible reference.
You know what? If you want to understand that reference, listen to our Megalopolis review. Yeah, so we've reached the end here. It's a very different episode of the OneTake Podcast. I feel like you saw a couple of less sure of themselves Gil and Daniels, because it's when you don't feel what everybody else is feeling, it could send you into a tailspin. You want to understand it. It was also just kind of a bummer, because I was thinking back. This is episode, I think, 11 or 12. And I was like, how many weeks in a row is it going to be like, I did not love this movie, and here's why. I was trying to think back. Do we like movies? I had to reassure myself.
Gladiator 1.
Yeah, but even that, there's a lot of nitpicking in that review. But we loved Gladiator 1. We liked Joker. I remember that. But if you were to ask me, like, what movies do you love? I wouldn't say Joker. Like, it's a good movie. That was pretty good.
But this happens to me, though, is I've had friends ask me, they'll be like, do you like movies? Because all I complain about so many movies.
Yeah, there was you loved Megalopolis.
Yeah, and you guys had to attack it relentlessly.
And I know there was at least, I was like literally, this movie really sent me into an existential crisis where I was like, do I like movies? And I know there was another one that we reviewed that I know we loved. Well, you weren't on this episode. Terrifier 3. I was a big fan.
I think I have at least a little more appreciation for this movie. Like, I think you helped explain a lot. And I kind of feel bad. Like, I wanted to like it more. It's disappointing.
Yeah. Hey, everybody, if you love this movie, that's awesome. Why don't you, this is what I would love. I feel like the typical reaction online, if somebody says something you disagree with, even on things that are so unimportant, that you like a movie or not, you want to attack them, tear them down. What I would love is for you to share in the comments what you liked about the movie, what made you love it. Because I find when you read reviews, they're very vague. And it's almost like they're allowed to say things without justifying them. The story was compelling. And you could just leave it there. But why was it compelling? Where was it compelling? And that's why you and we spent a lot of time debating before we recorded our first episode. What's our format? Is it a free-flowing conversation? Or is it, we're going to recap, go through the movie beat by beat? Or in episodes like this one, it's an hour free-flowing conversation. Then we go through the movie beat by beat. We do both. But this movie helped me see the value in going through it step by step. In a way, it's like double-clicking into any of those overarching critiques, positive or negative. The story was compelling. Double-click. Where was it compelling? Were there moments where it wasn't? And I feel like if you just write traditional reviews and newspapers, you get to just not even bother. You could just say the acting. I mean, I saw some people like Aaron Taylor Johnson. Acting was wooden. Okay, just leave it at that.
Well,
you don't have to justify.
These critics replace like thoughtful analysis with just snark, right? Like they just insert weird snark and you have to read between the lines. And it's like, oh, okay, they're implying this. I have no idea why, but they're speaking with authority. So
I'll tell you, like, I read the New York Times review for this movie. I can't even understand it. I can't even comprehend what I'm reading.
Do you remember like 2 years ago, we did a segment where I read to you AI generated nonsense reviews and I had you try to guess whether it was a real or a generated review.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Here, do you want me to read you a segment of this New York Times review? Can an actor so transform the effects, prosthetics, and rococo that we give up and give in to the gnarled, murderous pestilence towering over everybody? That's one barely concealed conundrum in this new Robert Eggers Dracula film, Nosferatu. What do you do when evil kisses better than your husband? Nothing, I'm afraid. You just whirlpool around the feeling. Which I actually agreed with. That's kind of what I felt like. Whirlpooling around a singular feeling. And I think that worked for some people. You're just kind of bathing in it. I guess like the movie's at-risk Victorian-era heroine until you're sunk, crying out for a scratch of the Dark Lord's claws. That terror feels like the movie's achievement. Eggers, along with his craft technicians and the actor Bill Skarsgård, has created the grossest-looking, ooziest, most cooked, most rotted, most mustached, least living Dracula I can recall. Definitely agree with that. And yet, what this Dracula radiates, the scariest thing about him, is greater than any of that totalizing power. Alas, after more than 2 hours of chomping and paling and fanticide and telepathy, I was so queasy with sympathy for all the sexual manipulation, so susceptible to it, that I'm ashamed to confess that I wanted my turn. Do me, baby. And I'm just... I don't know what I just read.
I'm confused.
I understood some of that at the beginning there. But at the end, I'm completely lost.
I don't know. I'm sick of not feeling things when I see movies. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call out into the spirit world for somebody to make me feel something through a movie.
Any spirit of comfort. Anything. All right, Daniel. Fascinating conversation. Interesting discussion. As always, it's great talking to you. Let's wrap it up here. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon for more. If you're listening and want to watch, check out the link that'll take you to the YouTube channel. If you're watching and you want to listen, check out the links that will take you to the podcast, or find us on any podcast app. With that, I'm Gil.
I'm Daniel.
And this is One Take.
What?
Yeah, I went back in time to Saulcast. I just got mixed up. I'm Gil. I'm Daniel. And this is Saulcast. We'll go with it.
Okay.
Dracarys!